In a courtroom packed with over 10 million viewers, Jasmine Crockett stands up against the tech mogul, Jeff Bezos, accusing him of using Amazon's power to manipulate elections and control the flow of information. As the pressure mounts, Bezos defends his empire with cold, calculated arrogance. But what happens next will change everything. With explosive evidence and a bombshell revelation, Bezos is forced to confront a truth he cannot escape. What did Jasmine say that left Bezos speechless? And how will he respond to this undeniable truth? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The congressional hearing room was suffocatingly packed, with more than 10 million Americans watching live. The tension was so thick you could almost feel it in the air. Jeff Bezos, the formidable founder of Amazon, stepped up to the witness stand, his stride calm yet purposeful, the kind of confidence only a billionaire tech mogul could exude. His gaze swept over the room, unflinching, as if the weight of the nation's scrutiny barely registered. Adjusting his suit with a nonchalant flick, he sat down slowly, his eyes meeting those of the committee members with a subtle, almost imperceptible nod. But across the room, the atmosphere shifted. Jasmine Crockett, the fierce Democratic representative from Texas, stood tall. Her every movement was filled with quiet, unyielding determination. As she took her first step toward the front of the room, all eyes turned to her, sharp, focused, ready for the showdown to come. This wasn't just a hearing. It was a battle that would either reinforce the power of corporate giants or expose their dark manipulation. The stakes had never been higher, and Crockett was prepared to bring it all to the light. The question at hand was explosive. Amazon, the empire Bezos had meticulously built, was now facing accusations of using its sprawling influence to tilt the political landscape in its favor. Allegations had surfaced that Amazon had funneled millions into political campaigns and strategically manipulated its platform to push its own agenda. The implications were staggering. If proven true, it would be nothing less than a betrayal of the very democratic principles this country was built on. Crockett knew this was her moment to tear down the veil of secrecy. As the room simmered with tension, Jasmine Crockett locked eyes with Jeff Bezos. The camera zoomed in on the two figures, the billionaire tech mogul and the fierce congresswoman, each representing polar opposites of power and accountability. The hush in the room grew thick, each moment drawing out the inevitable clash between corporate might and the voice of justice. Crockett's pulse quickened, but her face remained calm, unwavering. This was her moment. She knew that the eyes of the nation were watching, and this question would either expose Bezos for what he truly was, or elevate him further into the untouchable sphere he had worked so hard to create. With a deep breath, Crockett's voice rang out, slicing through the silence. "Mr. Bezos," she began, her words clear and deliberate, "Amazon is facing serious accusations. You stand accused of using your platform not only as a marketplace, but as a weapon, manipulating the flow of information to further your own interests and influence political outcomes. The American people deserve to know, how do you justify using the immense power of Amazon to manipulate public opinion?" There it was, the question that would cut to the heart of the issue. Bezos's eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second. He shifted in his seat, the calmness of his earlier demeanor beginning to crack. The room held its breath, every eye glued to the two adversaries. Crockett leaned in, not missing a beat. "Are you really telling us that Amazon, under your leadership, hasn't played a role in distorting the truth to serve its own agenda?" Her words didn't just echo in the room. They resonated through the corridors of power, challenging the very fabric of the system that Bezos had so carefully constructed. She had always known that this fight would not be easy, that she would be up against one of the wealthiest men in the world. But what infuriated her more than anything was the blatant disregard for the public's right to know. The manipulation of a platform that millions of Americans trusted. Bezos leaned back in his chair, his eyes momentarily drifting across the room as if calculating his next move. The weight of the question still hung heavily in the air, but now it was his turn to reclaim control. He cleared his throat and straightened, gathering his thoughts with practiced precision. "Let me make one thing perfectly clear," he began, his voice steady, smooth, almost too smooth. "Amazon is a platform. We provide services to millions, and we do so by offering a marketplace where people can buy and sell goods, and where ideas and opinions can be shared freely. We do not interfere in political decisions. We simply give people the tools to make their own choices. The words were well rehearsed, a rehearsed defense from a man who had spent years building an empire on the back of global commerce. But as Bezos continued, a cold, calculated edge slipped into his tone, as if daring anyone to challenge him. He glanced across the room, meeting the eyes of the committee members, trying to assert his dominance in the room. The conservative lawmakers, sitting on the far side, nodded approvingly, their unwavering support for Bezos echoing throughout the room. Crockett could feel the weight of their gazes, the unsaid allegiance between the billionaire and his political allies, and the injustice of it all. These were the very people who, with the stroke of a pen, could allow Amazon to keep operating without accountability. These were the people who wanted to protect a system that worked for Bezos, no matter the consequences for the rest of the country. The conservative members, now emboldened by Bezos's defense, leaned forward in their seats, eager to jump into the fray. Some raised their hands, others shook their heads in agreement. The tide was shifting, and the room was quickly becoming a battleground, divided between those who stood for corporate freedom and those who called for transparency and truth. Jasmine Crockett, undeterred, tightened her jaw. This was no longer just about a hearing. It was a fight for fairness, for accountability. The defense of Bezos felt like a slap in the face, a reminder of the immense power corporations like Amazon held. The tension between the two sides escalated, each word from the conservatives an attempt to drown out the truth. But Crockett wasn't backing down. Not now, not when the stakes were this high. With a sharp motion, Crockett slid a thick stack of documents across the table, her gaze steady as she watched Bezos. The room went silent, every person leaning in to catch her next words. As the papers came to rest before the committee, Crockett spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "These documents," she began, "are internal Amazon records that have recently come to light, and they reveal something disturbing, something that goes far beyond corporate negligence. They show, in black and white, how Amazon has used its access to customer data to fund political campaigns that Amazon has directly influenced. This data, information that millions of Americans have entrusted to you in good faith, has been sold to the highest bidder, and it's been used not just for marketing, but to manipulate the very process by which we choose our leaders." There was a heavy pause, the weight of her words sinking into the room. Crockett could feel the energy shift, the scrutiny now fully on Bezos. The billionaire sat motionless for a moment, his eyes scanning the papers, his breath shallow. He knew that the walls were closing in on him. He had built Amazon into an empire of unimaginable wealth and power, and yet now, in the face of undeniable truth, his carefully crafted world was beginning to crumble. But Crockett wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her voice unwavering as she addressed him directly. "Mr. Bezos, you've betrayed the trust of millions of people. Your company didn't just provide a service. It sold their most personal information to political campaigns. And those campaigns didn't just use that data to sell products. They used it to sell power. They used it to manipulate voters, to change the course of elections, all while you sat back and profited from the chaos you helped create." The room was electric with tension, the murmurs growing louder as the full impact of her statement began to hit. But Crockett wasn't done. She turned her full attention to Bezos, her eyes locked on his with an intensity that no amount of wealth or influence could shield him from. "This isn't just a corporate scandal, Mr. Bezos. This is a direct assault on the democratic process. You've used your platform to control the flow of information, to distort the truth, and to undermine the very foundation of our elections. And for what? For power? For profit?" Bezos shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but Crockett didn't give him a chance to respond. "You can sit there and claim that Amazon is a platform, that it's neutral, but we both know the truth. You have turned Amazon into a tool for political manipulation, and in doing so, you've compromised everything this country stands for." The tension in the room was palpable. Every eye was on Bezos now, the walls closing in. Crockett had laid bare the corruption at the heart of Amazon, exposing how the company's reach went far beyond retail. It had seeped into the very fabric of politics, manipulating the system to serve the interests of the few at the expense of the many. Crockett's voice rang out, sharp and resolute. You traded ethics for power. You traded the public's trust for personal gain. And now, you must answer for it. The tension in the room was palpable as the weight of Crockett's accusations hung thick in the air. Bezos, who had spent years at the top of the corporate world, leaned back in his chair with a slow, deliberate motion. The papers that Crockett had placed before him were a direct challenge to everything he had built, and for the briefest moment, he seemed to hesitate. But that moment passed quickly, replaced by the steely calm that had gotten him to where he was. He wasn't going to let a politician, especially one like Crockett, shake his foundation. Let me be perfectly clear, Bezos began, his voice unwavering, though there was an edge of frustration beginning to creep into his tone. He adjusted his suit slightly, an unconscious gesture that betrayed his attempt to maintain control. Amazon is a platform. It's a tool that serves millions of people every day. It connects buyers and sellers, creators and consumers. And as a company, we do not engage in political interference. We are simply a marketplace, and we have always operated within the law. He paused for a moment, making sure everyone in the room was listening, ensuring that his words would have maximum impact. The allegations you've thrown at us are baseless and nothing more than an attempt to distort the nature of our work. He exhaled slowly, clearly attempting to project an image of confidence, but there was a slight tightness in his jaw that Crockett couldn't ignore. His fingers tapped rhythmically on the table, as if searching for something to steady himself. What you and others fail to understand, he continued, his voice now carrying a bit more force, is that Amazon is built on the principles of freedom, the freedom of people to access information, to buy and sell freely. And just as you defend your right to speak your mind, I defend the right of companies like Amazon to operate without undue interference from government or individuals who misunderstand the mechanics of business. Bezos's words rang out, filled with the rhetoric of corporate defense that he had repeated countless times. But to Crockett, they sounded like empty justifications from a man who had long evaded real accountability. You speak of regulation, of fairness, Bezos said, his eyes narrowing slightly, but that's where your understanding falters. You want to control what we do, how we grow, how we operate, without understanding the very fundamentals of what makes these companies so successful. You're a politician, congresswoman, and you can't possibly grasp the intricacies of running a business on this scale. You're concerned with ideals, with optics, but what you fail to see is the bigger picture, the one that keeps the economy running, the one that creates jobs, opportunity, and yes, wealth for millions of people. The room shifted uneasily as Bezos finished his tirade. The conservative members who had been silent up until now nodded approvingly, their expressions betraying their loyalty to Bezos and his message. Crockett could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their support for Bezos amplifying the sense of injustice she already felt. Here they were, these men who had been bought and paid for by corporate giants like Bezos, agreeing with his narrative of unchecked corporate freedom. They wouldn't, see the harm in Bezos's empire. They were blind to the lives Amazon had affected, the communities it had shattered in its relentless pursuit of growth. Crockett clenched her fist beneath the table, but she didn't flinch. She was well aware of the trap Bezos was trying to set, making her look like an idealistic fool who didn't understand the real world of big business. He was trying to paint her as a politician who cared more about abstract principles than the gritty realities of economics. But she wouldn't let him get away with it. Mr. Bezos, Crockett said, her voice steady and cutting through the charged atmosphere. You talk about freedom, about opportunity, but your freedom comes at the expense of the very people you claim to serve. Amazon doesn't just operate within the law, it manipulates the law to its benefit. You've used your position to influence politics, to shift the balance of power in your favor, and you've done it while hiding behind the guise of freedom. This isn't just about business, Mr. Bezos. This is about exploitation. This is about your unchecked power. Bezos's eyes flickered for just a second. There it was, the briefest crack in his armor. But he recovered quickly, his lips curling into a faint, almost dismissive smile. "You still don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice taking on a condescending edge. "You're a politician. You see things in black and white. But the world doesn't work that way. Business isn't about ideals. It's about creating value. It's about building something that lasts. And yes, that requires making tough decisions. You wouldn't understand." Those last words struck like a punch to the gut. He was dismissing her, not just as a politician, but as a person. His arrogance was palpable. The way he reduced her, reduced anyone who didn't share his worldview, to something smaller, less capable of comprehending the greatness of what he had achieved. And that was the moment Crockett knew. She wasn't just fighting against Bezos's influence. She was fighting against a system that had allowed men like him to thrive at the expense of the very values that had built this country. Her voice grew firmer, the words clearer and sharper with every syllable. "I understand just fine, Mr. Bezos. I understand perfectly that your idea of freedom is about protecting your own wealth and power, not the people you've left behind. You call it business. I call it exploitation." The room was now a pressure cooker, the air thick with the conflict between them. Bezos had dismissed her, underestimated her, but Crockett wasn't backing down. Not now, not ever. The truth was on her side, and that was something no amount of corporate power could erase. Just as Bezos finished his defense, the room hung in the air, thick with his calculated words. He had made his case, asserting that Amazon was nothing more than a neutral platform, a service to the people. The tension between the committee members and the billionaire was palpable. But before anyone could respond, an unexpected voice cut through the charged silence. The man who walked in was Thomas Mills, a former senior data analyst at Amazon. For years, Mills had been a quiet observer, a cog in the machine that powered Bezos's empire. But now, standing in front of the committee, he was something else. He was the voice of the truth, the one who had seen behind the curtain and knew the full extent of what Amazon had been hiding. Mills paused for a moment, his eyes scanning the room, taking in the faces of those who had trusted Bezos's word, before finally speaking. His voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it that sent a shiver through the room. "I used to work for Amazon," he began, his words simple, yet they felt like an earthquake in the room. "And in my time there, I witnessed things that I cannot stay silent about anymore." A low murmur spread through the room as Mills continued, his eyes now focused on Bezos. "What you don't understand," he said, his voice steady, "is that Amazon wasn't just collecting data on users. It wasn't just building algorithms to improve shopping. Amazon was using that data to manipulate public opinion, to influence political campaigns, to push a political agenda, and all of it was under the direction of Jeff Bezos." The room fell completely silent. The weight of his words was enough to send shockwaves through the committee, the press, and everyone watching. Mills didn't pause as the murmurs of disbelief and shock echoed around him. He had already said the unthinkable, and there was no going back now. "It wasn't just a few isolated incidents," Mills continued, his voice now gaining in strength. "Amazon wasn't just a passive player. It actively used its massive data to target voters, to sway political outcomes, and yes, to manipulate elections. Amazon knew exactly what it was doing. Bezos knew exactly what it was doing. This wasn't a mistake. This was part of a carefully calculated strategy." Mills's words hit harder than any argument Crockett had made. He wasn't just a whistleblower. He was a man who had seen the inner workings of Amazon's massive engine. A man who had witnessed firsthand how the company had bent the rules, ignored the public's trust, and used its vast influence for personal and political gain. Bezos, the titan of tech, the man who had spent decades building his empire, was now standing in the middle of the courtroom, exposed. As Mills spoke, Crockett felt the surge of justice swell within her. This was the evidence she had been waiting for, the moment that would change everything. Mills wasn't just revealing data, he was revealing the corruption at the very heart of Bezos's empire. His testimony was a slap to the face of everything Bezos had tried to protect, a direct challenge to the billionaire's carefully maintained illusion of righteousness. Bezos's face had turned a shade paler, but he still held his composure, though it was clear that Mills's words had shaken him. For the first time, Crockett saw a crack in his armor. The confidence that had defined Bezos, the smugness with which he had brushed off her accusations, was beginning to erode. But he was not going down without a fight. Mills's eyes never left Bezos as he delivered the final blow. "This wasn't just about business, Mr. Bezos," he said, his voice tinged with disgust. "This was about power. You used Amazon not just to dominate the market, but to manipulate the political process, to shape the outcomes of elections, to protect your own interests. And you did it all while hiding behind the facade of corporate neutrality, claiming that Amazon was just a platform." Mills turned to address the committee now, his face a mixture of resolve and anger. The American people deserve better than this. They deserve transparency. They deserve a system that isn't controlled by corporations who can manipulate their way into power. And it's time for Jeff Bezos to answer for what he's done. The room was filled with shock and disbelief. The accusations were no longer just allegations. They were coming from someone who had been inside the machine, someone who had seen it all. Crockett could feel the weight of the moment settling in. This wasn't just a courtroom drama. This was a battle for the very soul of democracy, and for the first time, the truth was on their side. The room was thick with the heavy weight of Thomas Mills' testimony. Bezos's carefully built defense was crumbling under the force of undeniable facts. The energy in the room shifted. The billionaire, once sitting comfortably at the helm of one of the world's most powerful corporations, was now exposed, and there was nowhere to hide. Crockett could feel the momentum building. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she could take the fight to Bezos, not just as a representative of the people, but as their voice, demanding accountability. The injustice was clear. The stakes couldn't be higher, and now was her time to act. She stood tall, her heart pounding, her mind clear. The time for quiet politeness was over. Crockett's voice broke the silence, strong and unwavering. "Mr. Bezos, you've spent this entire hearing pretending that Amazon is some neutral platform, that your company is merely an entity providing a service for consumers. But the reality is far different." Her words echoed in the tense air, biting with truth. "You have used your immense power not just to innovate and grow your business, but to manipulate it for your own interests. And in doing so, you've hurt not only Amazon, but the very democratic principles that this country was founded on." Bezos' face hardened as he leaned forward slightly, his fingers tapping on the table in a rhythmic motion, an attempt to maintain control. But Crockett wasn't backing down. Her eyes locked onto his, unwavering as she pressed forward with the undeniable force of her words. "You've built an empire, yes, but you've done so at the expense of ethical values. The very trust that millions of customers placed in Amazon has been violated by you, Mr. Bezos. And in your pursuit of power, you've undermined the integrity of the political system that has been the foundation of this nation." Her words stung like fire, each one cutting through the carefully crafted image Bezos had spent years building. Crockett wasn't just speaking about business ethics. She was speaking about the trust between the people and the corporations that serve them. "You've turned Amazon into more than just a marketplace," she continued, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "You've turned it into a political tool, manipulating information, selling data to political campaigns, and altering the very course of our elections. You've used Amazon's reach to push your own agenda, without regard for the damage it's caused. The American people deserve more than this." The room was silent, the tension building as her words hung in the air. Bezos's face remained stoic, but Crockett could see the flicker of discomfort in his eyes. She could feel the weight of the moment settling in. She wasn't just questioning his actions. She was challenging the entire system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for so long. She could see the growing unease in the committee members, the realization that Bezos, the tech mogul, might not be the hero they had once imagined him to be. "This is not about free enterprise, Mr. Bezos," Crockett pressed, her voice rising, filled with the righteousness of her cause. "This is about responsibility. This is about accountability. You've let your empire grow unchecked, and in doing so, you've sacrificed the values that are supposed to guide not just business, but society itself. The American people put their trust in companies like yours, and you've abused that trust for personal gain." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle before delivering the final blow. It's time for you to be held accountable for your actions. You have to answer to the people who trusted you. I'm not just asking for an apology, Mr. Bezos. I'm demanding that you take responsibility. You must publicly apologize to the American people for the harm you've caused. And you must promise that Amazon will never again use its power to manipulate the political process. The people deserve that, and they deserve it now. Crockett's voice was unwavering, her eyes fierce with the fire of justice. The room, once filled with murmurs and shifting eyes, was now deadly silent. Crockett had spoken with such clarity, such force, that even the powerful Bezos found himself momentarily shaken. The air in the room felt thick, the battle lines drawn clearly. This wasn't just about a corporate giant. This was about restoring faith in a system that had been bent and twisted for too long. Crockett had thrown down the gauntlet, and the weight of her words left no room for escape. For the first time, Bezos was truly cornered, and the truth that had been hidden for so long was finally in the light. The injustice, the abuse of power, the disregard for the people, it was all laid bare, and now it was up to him to answer. Bezos sat back in his chair, his posture rigid, the weight of Crockett's accusations still hanging in the air like a storm cloud. The room had gone silent, every eye on him as he prepared to respond. The initial discomfort had passed, replaced by a sharp focus. He had been in moments like this before, facing public scrutiny, but this time felt different. This wasn't just a corporate challenge, it was a personal one. Crockett's words had shaken him, but he wasn't about to let her define the narrative. Not today. With a steady breath, he leaned forward, his eyes narrowing slightly as he met her gaze. His voice, when it came, was cold and controlled. "Let's be clear about one thing, Congresswoman," he began, his words deliberate, calculated. "I'm not the only one in this room with power. You want to talk about influence? Let's talk about the power you and your colleagues wield every single day. The political influence you all have is every bit as formidable as Amazon's. But you don't hear me accusing you of corruption, do you?" He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Amazon is a platform. We provide a service. We connect people. We create jobs. We innovate. We don't manipulate. We operate legally. Every single action we take is within the bounds of the law. He leaned back in his chair, his expression now more dismissive than defensive. "What you don't seem to understand, Congresswoman, is that businesses like Amazon are not the problem. The problem lies in the fact that you want to control us. You want to regulate us. You want to silence the free market. You can't seem to grasp that Amazon is here because of the freedom we have to grow, to expand, to innovate. You can't impose rules on a company like mine without destroying the very foundation that allows it to exist in the first place." The words were sharp, and Bezos knew they would cut. But he was playing a game of perception now, trying to shift the narrative. He was positioning himself not just as a businessman, but as a defender of a greater cause. "What you're asking for," he continued, his voice rising slightly, "is the destruction of innovation. You want to take away our freedom, our ability to act. You want to control how we do business. And in doing so, you destroy the very thing that makes America what it is, a country of free enterprise, of personal liberty." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room to gauge the reactions. Some committee members, mostly conservatives, were nodding in agreement, their expressions mirroring his disdain for government intervention. Crockett's words, so carefully crafted and laced with accusation, seemed to be falling on deaf ears. Bezos felt a wave of triumph, believing that he had just won the battle. He wasn't just defending his company, he was defending an ideology. Turning back to Crockett, Bezos's expression shifted, his lips curling slightly. "You're a politician, Congresswoman. You don't understand the complexities of running a business at this scale. You've never had to make the hard decisions, to navigate the pressures of global markets and international competition. You're too focused on your own narrow view, unable to see the bigger picture. You want to regulate everything because you don't have the vision to understand what it takes to build something like Amazon." The words were meant to sting, to deflate her argument, to strip away any authority she might have gained from her position. To Bezos, Crockett was nothing more than an idealistic figure, too small, too naive, to understand the complexities of the world he inhabited. It was the perfect deflection designed to make her feel small and out of her depth, to push her back into her political corner. You stand here attacking a company that has done more to innovate, to grow, and to provide opportunity than any other company in history, he continued, his voice dripping with disdain. And what do you offer in return? Bureaucratic red tape and a misguided sense of moral superiority. You're a politician who's lost sight of what truly drives progress: freedom. Freedom for businesses to grow, for individuals to succeed without being weighed down by government control. You don't understand what it takes to make the tough calls that create real change. You're too busy playing politics. Crockett, her fist clenched beneath the table, could feel the sting of his words. He was attempting to belittle her, to paint her as a well-meaning but hopelessly out-of-touch politician. But Crockett wasn't about to let him control the conversation. She knew the stakes were higher than his self-serving arguments about free market principles. Bezos, in his attempt to deflect and disparage her, had just exposed the very thing she had been fighting against: the unchecked power of corporations and their ability to manipulate the system for their own gain. His smirk was the final insult. Bezos had reduced the issue to a matter of personal freedom, as if his empire's unchecked growth and influence were a natural and inevitable consequence of progress. But Crockett wasn't fooled. She saw beyond the rhetoric, beyond the polished words designed to mask the damage caused by his corporate empire. To her, it wasn't about limiting freedom, it was about restoring balance, about ensuring that corporations like Amazon didn't control the very foundation of American democracy. The injustice was clear. Bezos had made his billions on the backs of ordinary people, and now he stood there, defending his right to control, to manipulate, to dominate. And Crockett would not stand by while he tried to erase the damage he had caused. The fight for accountability was just beginning. The explosive accusations Crockett had made during the hearing didn't just rattle Bezos. They set off a chain reaction that rippled far beyond the walls of the committee room. The moment the hearing broke for recess, the media machines kicked into high gear. News outlets scrambled to cover the latest bombshell. Amazon, the global behemoth that had revolutionized the way people shopped, was now accused of manipulating political campaigns and undermining the democratic process. The stories flooded the front pages, each headline a hammer strike against Bezos' empire, and each one more damning than the last. But the media wasn't the only force reacting to Crockett's words. As the story gained traction, social media exploded. Tweets and Facebook posts from ordinary citizens, political commentators, and activists alike began to flood the platforms with outrage. The hashtag #BezosManipulates began trending, with thousands of people sharing articles, personal opinions, and impassioned pleas for justice. People from all walks of life voiced their anger, disgust, and disbelief at the scope of the allegations. Amazon had once been a symbol of modern efficiency, the company everyone turned to for convenience. But now it was synonymous with corruption and power abuse. The online outrage was palpable, with viral videos and memes mocking Bezos, painting him as the villain in a story of corporate greed and political manipulation. Some called him the king of data, others, more bitterly, the puppet master, who had pulled the strings behind the scenes of political campaigns. What began as a few voices in a public hearing was quickly turning into a public outcry of mass proportions. Amazon is a tool of political control. Stop Bezos before he controls everything. One tweet read, swiftly shared and retweeted thousands of times. Another post read, "What happened to democracy? How did we let a corporation dictate our elections?" Every major platform was rife with condemnation, and the public was just beginning to understand the full extent of the issue. People were no longer asking, "Is this possible?" They were asking, "How could we have allowed this to happen?" As the public reaction grew louder, the pressure on lawmakers to act became undeniable. The momentum shifted rapidly, and soon calls for legal action against Amazon were everywhere. Public petitions emerged, gaining hundreds of thousands of signatures within hours, demanding that Amazon be investigated for its role in political manipulation. It wasn't just the media or a few outspoken politicians anymore. It was the people, rising up in unison, demanding accountability for corporate abuse. Across the country, the outcry was almost deafening. People in small towns, big cities, and even rural communities were now focused on the same issue. A new rallying cry had emerged. We demand justice for the American people. Signs, banners, and digital ads began appearing everywhere, demanding an investigation into Amazon's practices. The public was angry, and rightfully so. How had a company so deeply embedded in American life, a company trusted by millions, been allowed to manipulate the very system that was meant to protect the people? And it wasn't just the grassroots activists who were taking a stand. High-profile figures from across the political spectrum began voicing their support for Crockett's claims. Politicians, some from the conservative side, others from the liberal wing, united under the banner of justice. They saw this as more than just a political issue. It was about restoring faith in a system that had been eroded by unchecked corporate power. One former senator even took to social media to write, "This is a wake-up call for all of us. The power of corporations to influence politics has gone too far. We must act now." The calls for legal action were growing louder by the hour. The pressure on the government, on the Department of Justice, to launch an investigation into Amazon's practices was becoming impossible to ignore. People from all over the nation began to demand that Amazon be held accountable, not just for manipulating political outcomes, but for eroding the very fabric of democracy. The question was no longer whether action would be taken, it was when and how. Within 48 hours, lawmakers were drafting new legislation aimed at investigating tech companies and their involvement in political manipulation. The committee that Crockett had appeared before was already setting up additional hearings, and subpoenas were being issued. The federal government was on the move, but it was clear that the path forward wouldn't be easy. Bezos, who had long been untouchable, was now the center of a storm that threatened to engulf him. As the situation escalated, Crockett found herself at the forefront of this movement. She had known the battle wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't anticipated the sheer scale of the public outcry that would follow. People were not just reacting, they were demanding change. The sense of injustice that had simmered beneath the surface for so long had finally boiled over, and the call for corporate accountability was louder than ever before. The pressure on Bezos was now undeniable. In private meetings and behind closed doors, Amazon's executives scrambled to contain the fallout, but it was already too late. The genie was out of the bottle. Every corner of the media, from the most reputable outlets to social media influencers, was talking about the same thing: Bezos and Amazon's manipulation of the political process. Public sentiment had reached a boiling point. People were no longer willing to accept the corporate apologia that had long been the norm. The public wanted justice, and they wanted it now. The question wasn't if Bezos would face consequences, it was what those consequences would be. From the streets to the halls of power, everyone was talking about the same thing: accountability, change, justice. Crockett had sparked a fire, and now it was spreading uncontrollably. The fight for transparency, for fairness, had become a battle that could no longer be ignored. And as Crockett watched the wave of support for her cause swell across the nation, she knew this was just the beginning. The road ahead would be long, but she was ready. The people had spoken, and it was time for Bezos to answer. As the room buzzed with the lingering echoes of Bezos's defense, Crockett knew that the battle was far from over. Bezos had spoken with the polished arrogance of a man who had long been untouchable, cloaking his actions in the guise of freedom and business ethics. But the truth had already been laid bare, and now it was time for action. Crockett had come to this hearing prepared to expose the darkness behind Amazon's corporate empire, and now, with the weight of public opinion behind her, she was ready to push forward with the legal action that Bezos had tried so hard to avoid. She rose from her seat, her eyes burning with conviction. "Mr. Bezos," she began, her voice firm, commanding the room's attention, "you've spent this hearing defending your actions, claiming that Amazon operates within the law, that you've done nothing wrong. But we know the truth now. Amazon, under your leadership, has manipulated the very political system this country relies on. You've used your company's influence to sway elections, to distort public opinion, and to restrict access to information that is crucial for an informed democracy." The room was still, the weight of her words settling on everyone present. Crockett didn't allow herself to be distracted. She knew this moment was too important. You've abused your power, Mr. Bezos, and you've done it at the expense of the American people. Your manipulation of data, your use of Amazon as a tool for political gain, it is an abuse of the trust that millions of people placed in your company, and that cannot stand. Bezos sat there, his hands steepled before him, eyes narrowing slightly as Crockett's accusations continued. She could see the flicker of unease in his expression. Though he still tried to maintain the air of confidence, his guard was clearly slipping. This wasn't just another round of corporate defense. This was the moment where Crockett would demand accountability for the system that had allowed Bezos to run unchecked for so long. I am calling for an official investigation into Amazon's involvement in political manipulation, Crockett declared, her voice rising in intensity. This cannot be allowed to continue. It's not enough to point to your free market defense or hide behind vague legalities. The American people deserve to know the truth, and they deserve to see justice served. The power you have abused must be held accountable. Her words landed like a drumbeat, steady and unyielding. It wasn't just a call to action, it was a demand for justice. The atmosphere in the room shifted, a palpable sense of gravity settling over the proceedings. Crockett wasn't just questioning Bezos anymore. She was challenging the very system that had allowed him and others like him to operate with impunity. She was calling for a reckoning. As the tension in the room built, Crockett turned her gaze toward the committee members. The American people have been manipulated by corporate interests for too long, she said, her eyes scanning the room. And it's time for us to take a stand. We need to launch a full-scale investigation into Amazon's actions to ensure that no company, no individual is above the law. We must hold Bezos accountable for his actions and make it clear that the manipulation of our democracy will not be tolerated. Her words were like a rallying cry, the force of her conviction impossible to ignore. She could see the gears turning in the committee members' minds. Some were already nodding in agreement, while others, still loyal to Bezos and his vision of corporate freedom, shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But Crockett knew this moment was bigger than one man, one company. It was about restoring trust in the system, about proving to the American people that their government could still stand up to those who sought to abuse their power. Mr. Bezos, Crockett continued, her voice unwavering, you have manipulated data, influenced elections, and restricted the flow of information for your own gain. And now you will face the consequences. It's time for you to be held legally accountable for the harm you've caused, for the trust you've broken. You cannot continue to hide behind the facade of business as usual. The law applies to everyone, even you. Bezos' face hardened, his jaw clenched as he took in her words. He had been cornered, exposed, and now the full force of the legal system was beginning to bear down on him. The idea that he might actually be forced to answer for his actions, to be held responsible for the empire he had so carefully constructed, was something he had never fully considered. But now, with Crockett's call for an official investigation hanging in the air, the walls were closing in. He opened his mouth to respond, but Crockett wasn't finished. She wasn't going to let him sidestep the consequences any longer. This is not just about you, Mr. Bezos. This is about the millions of people who trusted Amazon with their personal data, with their privacy, and with their votes. This is about a system that has allowed corporate giants like you to manipulate the very core of our democracy for your own benefit. It's time for that to end. She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in before delivering the final blow. You will be held accountable, not just by this committee, but by the American people, and I will not stop until you are. You will answer for the damage you've done, and you will make amends for the harm you've caused. This is not the end, Mr. Bezos. This is just the beginning. With that, Crockett stood tall, her presence commanding the room. She had set the stage for the legal battle ahead, the battle that would force Bezos to confront the consequences of his actions. But as she stood there, she knew that this was just the first step. The investigation was only beginning, and the fight for justice had only just started. But the power of the people was on her side, and she wasn't going to back down. The road ahead would be difficult, but she was ready. Bezos would face the consequences for what he had done, and this time he would have no way out. The days following Crockett's impassioned call for action were filled with a frenzied rush of media coverage, legal teams scrambling, and public outrage that seemed to gain momentum by the hour. The sheer scale of the fallout from Bezos's actions had set off a firestorm, and now the inevitable had come. Action was being taken. The long-awaited legal proceedings reached a boiling point, and the fate of Amazon hung in the balance. The tension in the room was unbearable as the judge, having heard all the evidence and deliberated over the consequences, prepared to issue a ruling. Crockett stood in the back of the courtroom, her eyes fixed on the judge as the final decision was announced. The room fell silent, all attention directed toward the moment that would decide Amazon's future. The air was thick with anticipation, the weight of the past weeks pressing on everyone. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as he declared the decision. In light of the evidence presented, Amazon is hereby ordered to pay a massive fine for its unlawful interference in the political process, its violation of privacy, and the ethical breaches it has committed over the years. Furthermore, the company will undergo a complete restructuring, with new oversight measures put in place to ensure that such misconduct will not occur again. A ripple of shock and disbelief moved through the room. Crockett allowed herself the smallest of smiles as the judge's words sunk in. The colossal fine was unprecedented, a signal that the justice system was willing to take a stand against the unchecked power of corporate giants. But it wasn't just the financial penalty that resonated. It was the mandatory restructuring of Amazon, the company that had operated without oversight, without accountability for so long. The court's decision wasn't just a victory for Crockett, it was a victory for the American people, for anyone who had ever been crushed under the weight of corporate power. Bezos, sitting at the defendant's table, had grown visibly pale. For a moment, he seemed to be in disbelief, his eyes wide, his fingers twitching with frustration. The reality of the judgment was beginning to settle in, and for the first time in years, he looked like a man who had lost control. It was no longer about business or profits. It was about the devastating consequences of his actions. The ruling meant that Bezos would no longer hold the same power he once did. His grip on Amazon, once unshakable, was now compromised. The judge's words were final. Bezos would lose control of key projects, and a new board would be established to oversee Amazon's operations. Bezos had used Amazon's platform for his own benefit, and now the consequences were clear. He would no longer be the sole architect of Amazon's future. His legacy, so carefully crafted over the years, was now tainted, and his influence over the company was being stripped away. The man who had once been invincible was now facing the fallout of his greed and disregard for the greater good. Crockett stood tall, her heart pounding with a mixture of triumph and relief. This was what justice looked like. It wasn't about vengeance, it was about accountability. She had fought tooth and nail to expose the truth, to challenge the forces that had allowed Bezos to operate above the law. And now that fight had culminated in a victory. Amazon would be forced to change, forced to answer for its actions. It wasn't just a personal victory for her. It was a victory for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of corporate corruption. As the court session drew to a close, the room erupted in a mix of applause and murmurs. The world was watching, and Crockett knew that the decision would send shockwaves through the halls of power. But she wasn't done yet. This was just one victory in a much larger battle. As the media descended upon the courtroom, microphones thrust in her face, cameras flashing, Crockett turned to face the room, her voice steady and resolute. "This is just the beginning," she said, her voice clear and strong, cutting through the noise. "Amazon's punishment is only a small part of what needs to be done. This is about more than one company. This is about a system that has allowed corporations to exploit and manipulate the very foundation of our democracy. Today, we took a stand against that. But tomorrow, we fight to ensure that no corporation, no individual, is above the law." Her words echoed in the room, a powerful call to action for anyone willing to listen. She wasn't finished. The battle for justice was far from over, and she knew it. The fight for accountability would continue, not just against Amazon, but against all the forces that sought to distort and manipulate the system for personal gain. But for now, this victory was hers. And it was a victory for the people, for the American public who had been victimized by the unchecked power of corporations like Amazon. As she walked out of the courtroom, her shoulders squared with determination, Crockett knew that her journey wasn't over. This was the fight of her life, and she wasn't going to stop until the system was changed, until those who had abused their power were held accountable. Today had been a victory, but tomorrow the battle would continue. And she would be there, standing tall, fighting for the justice that so many had been denied for so long. As the final ruling was delivered and the weight of the courtroom began to settle, a quiet realization crept into the hearts of those who had witnessed the events unfold. For Crockett, standing on the precipice of victory, the true meaning of her fight began to sink in. This wasn't just about Amazon or Bezos or the specifics of a corporate scandal. It was about something deeper. It was about the power of the people, the power of justice, and the fight against a system that had been rigged for far too long. The true lesson from this story, as Crockett knew all too well, was that power, whether corporate or political, must always be held accountable. Bezos, for all his wealth and influence, had built his empire on the exploitation of the very people who trusted him. He had used his power to manipulate, to control, to shape the political landscape to his benefit, all while cloaking himself in the guise of a benevolent businessman. Crockett's victory was more than just a legal triumph. It was a resounding message to anyone who thought they were above the law. No one is untouchable, but the lesson wasn't just for Bezos, it was for all of us. For too long, we've lived in a world where the rich and powerful can operate without consequence, where corporate giants can sway elections, manipulate data, and control the flow of information without oversight. The fight for justice isn't just about exposing corruption in a single corporation. It's about rebalancing a system that is tilted too far in favor of the few and leaving the many behind. For Crockett, this victory was a beacon of hope, but it was also a reminder of the hard road ahead. The battle for fairness, for justice, would never be easy. She had faced personal attacks, ridicule, and the overwhelming influence of those with vast resources. But through it all, she had remained resolute in her commitment to the people. She understood that the real fight wasn't won in the courtroom. It was won in the hearts and minds of the public. It was won in the quiet moments when everyday people stood up and said, "Enough." The injustice that Crockett had faced was the same injustice that millions of people felt every day, whether they were at the mercy of corporate greed or political manipulation. And in that moment, as she stood before the crowd, the lesson was clear. It is not enough to simply expose corruption. We must demand change, not just from those at the top, but from the systems that allow them to thrive unchecked. We must not only speak the truth, but act upon it, no matter the cost. Her victory was a testament to the resilience of one individual's fight against a corrupt system, but it also highlighted the power of collective action. People had rallied around her cause, not because she was a politician, but because she was fighting for them. She was fighting for the countless voices that had been silenced for too long, for the people whose trust had been exploited by those with the means to manipulate and control. In the end, it wasn't about one woman or one company. It was about the people who believed in the possibility of a better world, a world where justice could prevail. The echoes of her words in the courtroom were a rallying cry for anyone who had ever felt powerless. It was a call to arms, a reminder that no matter how deep the corruption runs, there will always be those who are willing to stand up and fight. Crockett had shown that even in the face of overwhelming odds, the power of truth, the power of justice, and the power of the people could not be silenced. As she stood there, knowing that her journey was far from over, the lesson was clear. Change doesn't come from waiting. It comes from action. And no matter how impossible the odds may seem, standing up for what's right is the only way to make a difference. In that moment, as the room slowly emptied, Crockett's resolve hardened. She had already won the first battle, but the war for justice was far from over. And with the strength of the people behind her, she would continue to fight, not just for herself, but for a society that demanded fairness, transparency, and accountability from those in power. It was no longer about the fight for one person's reputation. It was about restoring the integrity of an entire system, a system that, for too long, had been abused by those who thought they could escape the consequences of their actions. The world had seen the power of one person standing against the odds. The real question now was, what would the world do with that power? The answer was simple. The fight for justice had only just begun, and no one was going to stop it. As the final ruling echoed through the courtroom, the gravity of what had just transpired hit Crockett like a wave. Bezos, once the untouchable titan of Amazon, had been forced to pay the price for his manipulation of the system, his abuse of power laid bare for all to see. Yet as she stood there, watching the consequences unfold, Crockett knew that this victory was not the end. It was only the beginning. The lesson of this moment was not just about holding one person accountable for their actions. It was about exposing the deep-rooted injustices within the system that allowed men like Bezos to thrive unchecked, to use their wealth and power to bend the rules to their favor. For too long, corporate giants like Amazon had operated with impunity, manipulating the very structures of democracy for their benefit. And for too long, the voices of those who fought for justice had been silenced or dismissed as idealistic or naive. But now Crockett had proven that even the most powerful could be held accountable. She had stood firm in the face of adversity, pushed back against the overwhelming tide of corporate influence, and made her voice heard when it mattered most. The victory wasn't just hers, it was a victory for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of corporate greed, for every person who had watched as the system worked against them. The lesson that had become clear to Crockett through her battle was that no one, no matter how powerful, was above the law. The truth had the power to dismantle the walls of corruption, to expose the manipulation, and to bring about change. But that change wasn't easy. It required courage, persistence, and an unshakable belief in what was right. Crockett had faced unimaginable obstacles: political opponents, media scrutiny, personal attacks. But she had pressed on because she knew that justice wasn't a luxury for the few, but a necessity for the many. Bezos had tried to deflect, to hide behind his corporate defenses, but Crockett had refused to let him. She had shown the world that even the most powerful figures could be challenged, and that the pursuit of justice was worth any cost. The fight wasn't just about one company, it was about the people, about restoring trust in a system that had been warped by corporate interests. It was about giving a voice to those who had been ignored, exploited, and silenced. As she stood at the podium, Crockett realized that this moment would be remembered as a turning point, not just in her career, but in the broader fight for corporate accountability. It wasn't just about winning a legal case. It was about proving that the will of the people could overcome the grip of the powerful. She knew the road ahead would be long, and the challenges would continue, but the message had been sent. No one was above the law, and no matter how entrenched the system seemed, change was possible. Her fight wasn't over, and Crockett wouldn't stop. She would continue to stand up for justice, for fairness, and for a system that worked for everyone, not just the wealthy and powerful. The victory had proven that one person's voice could make a difference, and she would carry that lesson with her, pushing forward, relentless in her pursuit of a more just world. This was just the beginning of the fight for what was right, and she would not stop until the work was done. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.